I want to go into the issue of relationships. And clearly, everyone here is aware of the value of relationships. In fact, yesterday when you were asking people what were they most interested in the next day, that was the issue that they were most concerned about. How do we build community through relationships? And I think that people who are on this particular website get that that's the foundation of student success, that is the foundation of engaging families, that is the foundation of building strong communities. It is this idea of we are all in this together and we need to be respectful. So we've been talking about relationships, and I think the context of asset versus deficit is something that most people on this call will understand, that we need to be looking toward the assets of the people that we work with. But I think it's important to say, particularly at this moment in time, it's also very easy to fall into a pattern of pity. And when you pity someone, you can't build a true relationship. You can't build a partnership when you pity someone. And we have to remember way back in the beginning of these 2 days, Denzel, when you talked about the act of migration itself is an entrepreneurial act. I thought that was so incredibly powerful. I'm just trying to work on my screen here a little bit. That was such an incredibly powerful moment because it speaks to the strengths that immigrants have that we sometimes forget when we are so concerned about them that we're worried and pitying them. We forget they are strong. We forget they are organized. We forget they are resilient. And those are the people who have actually made it to the United States as immigrants. Even the people who are right now at the border. Think about the resilience and the strength that it took to make those arduous journeys. So we have to constantly remind ourselves that these are people who have values and strengths that we can learn from, that we should be respecting, and that we need to provide an opportunity to hear about. I work with a community leader in Maine who works with many immigrant families there, and she said, you know, the ones who get to the United States, they're the success stories. They're the ones who have made it. And once they get to this country, we pull the rug out from under them. We don't really explain how school works. You know, there are great stories about people getting a bus schedule who may never have taken a bus because everybody just walked to a school in their community. We don't tell them how to advocate. We don't really instruct them in the ways that so many people who were born here, particularly those who are middle class, understand. And so we constantly keep them in a deficit mode. And we need to think about ways to make sure that they have the information they need to be stronger and to build on their resilience. We need to give them a voice. And it was very interesting, you know, the wonderful, wonderful strategies and exercises and classroom lessons that have been shared here, including the recent ones on empathy. And then there's a concern about, well, how are people in this, is everybody going to want to participate at that level? And I'm going to suggest that there are many, many ways we can be giving immigrant families, newcomer families, a voice and be listening to them. And yes, the stories, the narratives are so critical, but we can't limit it to that. We can't provide this activity over here that lets you talk about who you are and then not give the people a voice at other times. And I'll give you an example or two. I was a parent leader in a very diverse high school, and we worked really hard at engaging our immigrant families and bringing them into the parent organization. I happen to be a big believer in PTAs. I think it's an infrastructure that exists, and we need to just figure out how to make it more inclusive, make it more welcoming. And we were working at that in this high school, and there was a discussion at one of these meetings about the upcoming homecoming dance. And And the principal at that time was there, and some teachers, and some of the parents, the immigrant parents, said, well, you know, we want a chaperone. And the teachers and some of the white parents said, oh, you don't want a chaperone. Your kid doesn't want you there. And a Latina mom said, yes, my child wants me there. And several of the other immigrant parents said, actually, I'm not comfortable with my child being there unless I'm there. It took a while for the discussion to go on, but in the end, it was open. Chaperones were open to parents. You had an option of being there. We had a number of immigrant parents who did chaperone. The music became much more diverse because they had a voice, and the students had a voice in what was going to happen. And there was a significant increase in the number of immigrant students who were at that very significant high school rite of passage, a homecoming dance. So that's a way to listen to families. Another time I was working in a community where there had been some tension between families, the families who had lived there for many years and families who were newcomers. And it happened that the families who had lived there for many years were largely African American, and the families who were moving in were largely Latino. And I was working with faculty throughout the year, and I was working with families throughout the year. It was really one of my most meaningful projects because I really got to work with the entire school community at the same time on these issues. And it culminated in a very powerful community meeting, which many of the teachers attended as well, to discuss the issues. In the corner of the room was a large group of the Latino parents who were there with a translator who was doing simultaneous translation. And they all had headsets. And I was very conscious of speaking slowly so that the translator could translate, and making sure that if one of the parents or teachers spoke up, that there was time for the translator again to share that. But I did notice that it was a one-way communication, which is not with the Latino families, with the immigrant families. It was not the way to build community or relationships. So I consciously looked over in the corner to the group of the families who were sitting around a table, and I looked over it and I said, what do you think about the question that was just posed? And that changed the dynamic. And several parents who had been sitting at that large table stood up, and several of them talked through the translator. A few spoke in English, and their English was very easy to understand. Was it the perfect English of a native speaker? Some, maybe some not, but again, a way to make people feel welcome and included is to be very clear that whatever level of your language you have is just fine. We are all okay with that. And we understand what you're saying. And one of the most powerful speeches from any family member there was from a grandfather who was sitting at that table, who got up and spoke in English. And no one will forget the comments that he made. They were very heartfelt and they were very meaningful. And had I not consciously looked over there, I don't think he would have stood up. And I learned that technique from some of my training, that looking at someone and specifically asking isn't just a one-on-one thing. It's a group thing. If there are people in a group that are not speaking, sometimes they just need you to look at them and say, what do you think? And pause. So those are powerful ways to be inclusive, to build relationships that are not just specific exercises aimed at that. This is an everyday thing. And it goes to a belief in your head and in your heart that your encounter with every individual is not just for you to share what you know or help them, but to figure out what it is they have to teach you. And I've done several years of classes for immigrant parent leaders. And I have learned so much, far more than I could ever have taught them, far more than I could ever share. One of the ongoing lessons I always refer to is that a typical American white middle-class high school parent will say, by 15, my kid is done. I'm not spending my weekends with them. Where the immigrant families did everything together as families. And I'm not going to tell them that's wrong, because that's not how we do it. I'm going to learn from that. So I also want to make sure that we understand that in listening to immigrant families, we have to know, we can't just, again, assume we know what they need. Denzel, if you could put up that one chart from Young Chun Han's different levels of parent leadership, parent engagement, involvement. That is something that Laura Gardner talked about yesterday. It's going to be in the charts. It's going to be in the resources. And I also, I'm putting in the resources. It was not only the chart of the different levels of parent involvement, but it also explains what the different levels are. And this is from Young Chun Han, who is an amazing immigrant parent leader in Maryland. And she wrote this chapter for my book, for my second book. And the point I want to make about this is that the way to find out what immigrant families really want is to build relationships so you have some cultural connectors. These are people who feel comfortable being at the school, and they also feel comfortable. There's different information on this, and again, it's in the resources, so don't feel that you have to read it now, but you want to get to these cultural connectors who are seeking out information, and they also have connections with their own community, and they can share the information with them. So you can take that down now, Denzel. Thank you. Again, it's in the resources about knowing what your community wants, about listening to the different people at the different levels, and making sure you are not assuming you know what your community needs or wants or how to build these relationships. And I just want to go in the last few minutes on this building relationships. I want to talk about specifically what we need to do today in today's environment, where there is a lot of fear among our immigrant families. And it doesn't matter whether they are themselves, whether they're concerns themselves, or whether they have family members, or your child's best friend, even if you've lived here for generations. This fear among immigrant families is really impacting our schools. And I did an article for Educational Leadership after I'd interviewed educators around the country about this issue. There's a link to the article here, and also it's in the resources. I've discussed these points at length. And they were based on interviews I did with educators and community leaders around the country. First of all, build this trusting relationship we've been talking about. Make sure that the families know you are someone that they can trust, that they are entrusting their children with you. They're the reason they came here in many cases, and you want to continue to build that. The second point is you want to provide stability. So many times educators just want to fix things. We want to go out there and we want to do it. And you can, as I talk about later, you can be engaged in advocacy. You can be doing so many other things, but what you can do every single day is to be a stable force for the child and the family. And that has unbelievable impact. That's what families keep telling me. They know every day their child has a place to go and it's safe. You can certainly connect them to resources and legal advice, but it is very important you do not give any legal advice. It can change from minute to minute, as we heard, and also that's not your role. Your role is to support them and connect them to resources. You can help them develop emergency plans, again, speaking to how strong so many of these parents are. You can help them figure out, if this happens, what do I do then? Many of them don't want to face it. I certainly wouldn't want to face it, but you can help them build these. You, outside of school, can join a community-based effort. You can be a force for building a respectful school culture. But at the bottom line, you need to continue to engage families in learning. Don't assume that just because there's turmoil in their lives or their country, they don't want to know what's going on with their child. They do. Continue to value them. Continue to do what you know is right to help them be a part of their child's learning. And continue to focus on what's important on a day-to-day basis. It's easy to spin out with everything going on. So just do the job that you know you can do. And there's a discussion at length on all of these points in the article. Okay, Denzel, you can take that down. And the last few minutes, I am using my the opportunity I have is to be the last speaker of the day to just give you an opportunity to reflect a little bit about what you have been hearing throughout the day and how it is touching you. So I'm going to ask you to respond to 3 questions individually. I'm going to pose the first question here. What did you hear in the past 2 days that spoke to your heart? If you could type a couple things in the chat box, we'll talk about that. What, as you were listening to all of these speakers in the past 2 days, what is it that spoke to your heart? Radical courage. Yeah, I love that phrase. Building relationships. It's amazing how the 2 days were about that. The microaggression things that go on every day. Empathy, empathy, empathy. I love the idea. Empathy is not trying to find myself in you. I love that. Listening. Yeah, what does it take to really listen? What does that really mean? We have to open our hearts every day to our students, using art, using music, and within the curriculum. There's a great chapter on an activity like this that was done as part of a literacy curriculum at a school in Brooklyn. It's a chapter in my book, Engaging Diverse Communities, Innovative Voices in Education, Engaging Diverse Communities, and there's a link to that. Wow. I feel like I'm sometimes arrogant in the way I work with immigrant students. I mean, talk about being uncomfortable in what you're saying. And we all know if we're not uncomfortable, we don't get there. I find that on a weekly basis, I have an aha moment. So now I'm going to pose another question. What did you hear that spoke to your head? What is it getting you thinking about what you heard? Are there the situation's more serious for immigrants than I realized? Get names and nicknames right, including your own. Don't have somebody call you Mrs. K. All my own biases and prejudices that I'm barely aware of. This has been a very successful event if people are really starting to do that level of thinking. It's time for change and action. Yeah, this is an important dialogue. We need to continue it. The data that Denzel released in the beginning is so important. We need to change the narrative. We need to change the factual narrative. This is head stuff, folks, the factual narrative about immigrants. And I'm going to ask one last question here. What's one new idea that you're going to implement with your students and families? You just name one. I'm hoping there's a lot. But what's one thing you are saying, wow, I'm going to do that? Oh, I want to make a welcome book. Professional development, connecting with families, changing my dialogue. Wow. Reaching out, the story exchange. Young-Chun Han's pyramid. Oh, it's so great, folks. It changes your whole way of viewing immigrants. You know they're not a monolith, but it really gives you a way of thinking about it. Again, she wrote a whole wonderful chapter in my book, that if you're interested in this issue, it's worth reading. Oh, thank you. Read my books and articles. That makes me feel good. Look at the time here. Wow, a 3x5 card set with a card for each student, their pronunciation, nickname, country of origin. That is so powerful. Building more effective relationships, not just with students, but the entire community. Where does your name come from activity? I use that a lot in my adult education when I work with teachers or family members. Just asking a question, where does your name come from, is very powerful. Sometimes people talk about their last name. You know, my last name and those of my family were changed a generation ago because of anti-Semitism. Sometimes people talk about their first name. It's very, very powerful. Welcome chat room for parents and teachers. Parents as leaders, yeah. So again, Denzel, I'm looking at the time. I figure I have just a couple more minutes here. And I want to emphasize again that this issue of relationships is so critical. When you talk to students about who made a difference in their life, it was the person they had the relationship with. Because when you have a relationship with a child or a family, they know you care about them. And when you care about them, they're open to learning from you, and equally important, you are open to learning from them. And that's what this is all about. Denzel, were there any other questions posed for me that you picked up on?
Well, you have them typing statements, not questions. So I think they're in that reflective mode. But if you have any questions for Eileen, this is your chance on maybe some specifics on building those relationships in particular circumstances. What has been challenging for you that Eileen can probably give you a suggestion about? I know we've had a lot of previous questions about
I want to add, you know, since there's a minute, I want to add one thing.
Okay.
I think sometimes we make assumptions that white middle-class parent leaders really don't want to connect with immigrant families. They really want, we stereotype them. You know, I'm a white middle-class PTA leader, and I had many colleagues who felt as I did that we wanted to do what we could to build an inclusive parent organization. And you don't get training on that as a parent leader. And so I think sometimes it's just helping. When we talk about professional development for teachers, I think we need to be doing more of it in our school communities for families. Whenever I go and work with teachers, I always ask if I can meet with the PTA leadership, because they need to get an opportunity to think through some of the things we've just been saying here. And they don't understand what welcoming and inclusive really means. It's more than sending out a flyer in 2 languages. It's engaging families in different ways. So that's just something I also would like you to think about.
All right, we do have a couple questions, and I wanted just to bring everyone back because we all have such great suggestions. The best way of approaching schools regarding the inclusion of immigrant parents in PTA. Maybe some short, pithy answers. Who wants to go?
I mean, I think it goes back to the idea of making sure that they have the right narrative of who immigrants are, because there is so much rhetoric about, you know, the idea that immigrants, including students and families, are a drain on the system, as opposed to immigrant families being a resource for all of us. I think that's where it all starts. That this benefit.
The idea that they have nothing to add, right?
Correct.
When in fact they do.
Correct. Even David says his parents said, we don't know anything, so we want you to connect with others. I mean, I think it was wonderful that they gave him that opportunity, but we need to make all parents feel they do have a lot to contribute, and we need to give them a forum for doing that. It benefits every single one of us. So, you know, the foundation of all my work is this idea that everybody benefits when we are in diverse schools, when we are in diverse communities that are based in equity, when everybody has a voice. Because if some people don't have a voice, then I don't benefit. My kid doesn't benefit. And if we isolate our children in schools where people with the luxury of choosing a house choose a house where everybody looks like them, then those kids don't benefit. So it's not just that we're helping those poor immigrant children and families. This is building a stronger society. This is helping my child and your child and everybody who lives in every one of our communities. That's the narrative we need to get out there.
Claire, I think you wanted to add something?
Yeah, so I think one way to get parents engaged is when you're doing these activities in your classroom, invite them during the process, and also to showcase, invite them to take part in some of these activities during parent, association meetings. If your school has websites, make sure that they're informed about what's going on in your classroom so that they can also start to become engaged, and as students start bringing these ideas home, that they're also kind of moving the needle towards success, and maybe stop watching the news and having these discussions at your table with the right type of information.
I'd like to add something here. I loved what Claire, I'm just enamored of the welcoming book. So I loved the way in which she talked about bringing the faculty, the staff, the students, everybody, and parents, everybody together kind of to do this. We have two exchange, and so once you kind of tried an exchange in school, you can roll this out. You can get the PTA involved, you can get to the families involved, and we have two examples. One was the picture I showed you, the difference exchange. We made that an open call to say, we're going to do this on these 2 evenings, and we had an evening in between, so they had time for, we're going to do this, and RSVP so we know how many to prepare for. And that's why we had, 45 people show up from ages 10 to 70 to tell those stories. We are doing a big one at the opening of school year called Music as the Story of Our Lives, between our immigrant and non-immigrant families. And the adults will be telling stories in one area in our music building, in fact. And and then the students will be off, actually with the science faculty facilitating there. So we're very excited about that, because one of the things that the families told us is they wanted to share their music. That was something that came up last year. So there is a way to do this where you bring them all together, and it's quite beautiful.
And Denzel, real quickly, I just want everyone to make sure to open up that entire toolkit from Welcoming America, because it also has 4 other lessons that we didn't get to discuss today, including incorporating music into community learning.
Good.
I want to add one more thing. I actually would like to suggest that to engage parents, ask yourself, how are you coming across? How do you think they're perceiving you? Because it doesn't matter what kind of tool, strategy, program you're going to have there. You might be spending money, buying food. If they do not see you as really welcoming and accepting of them as they are, it's not going to work. So just ask yourself, how are you coming across? That's what I would suggest to teachers. I do this all the time.
Jen, I also
All right.
I just wanted to add one more thing about the whole issue of seeing people as your equal and not pity, etc. There are schools that will raise money for another school, and they make a big deal about giving the money or the products to another school. And this is not a way to create a community where everybody feels valued. It's the best of intentions, but it doesn't feel that way. So quickly, what this high school used to do is we'd have clothing drives, and we gave it to the local Salvation Army. And then the Salvation Army gave little cards to immigrant families or others who needed it through the social worker. So we got the amount of credit based on what we donated to the Salvation Army. Then the people who needed it got a credit to go and shop. And you weren't just taking the handed off jeans from the kid that you might be sitting in class with. You got to go and choose something from the whole large place. So to be constantly thinking of ways to be respectful and to view others as equals, as opposed to they need my help, so this is what I'm doing to help you.
That's why we're trying to change the narrative into something more fact-based, which shows that immigrants are assets, not deficits. Our very last point, before we leave, I want each of you perhaps to give your favorite tip or the one thing, actionable item that teachers can do, all our educators in this webinar, to change the conversation on immigration, to change the conversation with immigrant communities, to make immigrants feel safer and more welcome. What's the one thing that each of you would like to say, maybe in 10 seconds?
We've talked about students. You need to bring the power players, whether it's a principal or someone else, into an exchange with an immigrant and get them to know one-on-one, power levels erased, each other as human beings. Because if you don't get the power players to know the importance of relationship and empathy, then our work is so much harder.
I think that to consciously be thinking at all times, what do I have to learn from this other person right there? And there will be a value that comes from that. And it'll be reflected in your language, and it'll be reflected in what the students hear and what the families hear. And people will know who you are in the community. To consciously be thinking about the value that immigrants bring and to be sharing that narrative, not someone else's narrative, what you've seen, what you've heard, why this means something to you.
I agree with all of those. I also believe in finding spaces where you can fit this into your curriculum. I think a big asset is using history, as we talked about yesterday, using first-person accounts from history and making the connections to today. I think that really helps with shaping the narrative, to see that, you know, these mistakes it's not the first time, and you know what they say, when you make a mistake twice, shame on you. So using history as much as you can and just continue learning and listening.
And I would
Eileen thought she was getting the last word, but it's Alaisa.
I would add to empathy, I would add compassion, because empathy, you can put yourself in the person's place and understand that it's so much suffering, but compassion, you take it to a different level. You not only understand where they are, but you develop the wish to do something about it. So if you have that, it doesn't matter what kind of administration you work for, you know, it doesn't matter where you are, you are going to find a way to reach them. Thank you.